Hello.
Hi, Jess. You're on mute.
I swear I hit that. Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, Anna.
Hi, nice to meet you all.
We should have a really great turnout tonight.
Fantastic.
Anna, I am going to do a brief introduction and then let you do the main presentation and then do the things that I would typically do in the beginning, but I want to give you the upfront time. So everybody who comes in every month will do all of our usual stuff towards the end.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I have an hour for my presentation and Q&A.
You take whatever time, we'll take you as long as you'll stay with us. So
Okay, great. Yeah,
we don't have a time restraint and we usually end up gabbing kind of afterwards anyways. So
that's great. Yeah, sometimes I have a tendency to run over, so that's good to hear.
you can't get native plant people talking about native plants without that.
I know. Yeah, and I feel like I like giving people the extra information. I think people are so eager to learn.
Right. So I'm going to share my screen briefly and then I will stop sharing to let you do your stuff. Let's try this. For anybody who's seen me do that switcheroo multiple times, did you notice how many less tabs I had this time than usual? So many less tabs. Hi, Marilyn.
Hi, Marilyn. Nice to see you. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Here now.
It's nice to see everybody.
Yeah.
Good to see you too.
Can I gloat a bit? I'm in Maine, where Anna probably is too, and it's so nice and cool. It's a beautiful evening, but we're having a drought.
Yes,
Well,
unfortunately.
it's actually cool here relatively. It's not in the 90s. It was only like 80 today, so it was lovely. Also a drought, but
We've gotten in southern Maine, we've gotten a little bit of rain in the last couple of days, but it always seems to miss Portland where I live, unfortunately.
It always seems to miss Islesboro too.
Yeah, the coast, I think it just gets kind of pulled back out.
Right. Oh, well, figure out how to deal with it, right?
Yeah. We just have to plant drought tolerant plants.
For some reason, the conditions have made the stilt grass in my yard like stand out. So I've been pulling stilt grass like a madman for like a week and a half now. I got mounds of it everywhere. I don't know if it's doing any good, but it feels satisfying.
feels good.
Yeah.
I've been reading about nimblewill, which is apparently a native grass that will outcompete stilt grass, but I cannot identify it at all. Even though with help from Susan and different people, I can't ID it.
I have them growing. I have them growing together, so it's easy for me to kind of identify the two. It
So
looks a lot like stilt grass, it just is much thinner blades.
But you can ID it. Good for you.
It's called what? Nimblewill?
Nimblewill. It's what's the purple one? It begins with an M. It's oh shoot, come on, Marilyn. It's a name you would recognize. The family, the species name you'd recognize. Muhlenbergia. It's a Muhlenbergia.
Oh.
I'm not sure which one, but it's a native.
I love Muhlenbergias.
This one I don't think is dramatic as the purpley one,
Hmm.
but it's if it outcompetes stilt grass, then I'm happy.
Yeah, that's wow.
Rick, have you noticed that it's competing with it?
You know what? I think you just have to give it a leg up. So in the areas where I've cleared out stiltgrass in the past, I'm still getting stiltgrass popping up, but the nimblewill is filling in.
Great.
And I've got areas of the yard that are entirely nimblewill. I think it's pretty aggressive once it gets going. I think if you let it seed, it will spread pretty aggressively.
Well, it's a good test.
Yes.
I wonder if Casmanthium would be a good match for stiltgrass.
That's a good idea. I think I've read somewhere there too that it's good because it's so aggressive and it grows in the shade like stiltweed will. So I mean stiltgrass will. So maybe we should change it to stiltweed instead of stiltgrass. Yeah. But yeah, I've heard that it's a pretty good good one to grow in the same place.
And you can at least tell those two really apart very easily.
Yeah. And it has those beautiful seed heads.
Oh, I know. It's really nice.
But yeah, we've made the mistake of planting a lot of it when I was working at Garden in the Woods in Massachusetts, and it seeded itself in a lot of different places.
Places you weren't expecting. I'm hoping to get home and find some growing there because I got some seeds from we were collecting at Brandywine and I was going, and so I threw them around the yard and just to see if that would would work. So I don't know if I have any or not.
When do you come back, Marilyn?
Not until the end of September. So I miss a lot of stuff.
No, but
A lot
there's
of plants.
going on. You come back to a lot of goldenrods and asters coming in.
Yeah.
We welcome you. All right, guys, it is a couple minutes after 7, so we're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody to our August meeting of Southeastern PA chapter of Wild Ones. For those of you who are joining us from abroad, we are the local chapter of the national nonprofit Wild Ones. There may be a chapter in your area. Take a peek at the website that was included when I sent out the invitation for tonight's meeting. And the recording of this will be put onto our chapter's YouTube channel if you want to check it out then. We are currently at 145 members in our chapter. There are new seedling chapters sprouting up often and around us. So members are getting dispersed to those different areas. We want to introduce you to just the few people to help get our chapter going. I'm Jessie Schiffler. I'm the president. I'm the one that sends out most of our emails. If you had a question about tonight's presentation, I didn't mean to not answer you. I just sent the link. We got over 100 people who requested the link for tonight's meeting. So that was a little overwhelming for me. So I apologize if I didn't give you your specific answer, but I think everything will be covered in tonight's meeting. Audrey is our vice president. She is changing locations currently, so I'm not sure that she's going to be on our meeting tonight. Susan takes care of our wonderful newsletter, which you'll all receive along with the link to the recording, and she puts our content up on our website. Denise is our treasurer. She's also moving between houses. I'm not sure if she's traveling right now or not. Lindy is our membership chair. She reaches out to new members and people interested in the chapter. Marilyn is with us tonight and gives us lots of great advice and information about native plants all around. And Anne is helping us with our homeowner advising committee, which we're still trying to launch. Lots of ways to reach us and information on these different We have a website, we have a Facebook page, we have our YouTube channel, we have an Instagram, which Lindy puts content on. So if you ever have a need to get us in any of these ways, reach out and we will try and get back to you as quickly as we can. We like to shout out our new members. Phyllis is back. She's in Warwick. I talked with Phyllis when I first thought about starting this chapter. And so it's really exciting that she's back in the chapter. We have a new Philadelphia member. Becky in Chester Springs is really excited to learn with us and share. And then we had 111 RSVPs for our featured presentation, and that's above and beyond the over 500 people that received the meeting invitation as a standard. So really excited for the good turnout. And without further ado, I am going to tell you just a little bit about Anna, and then I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and let her take over. As the Wild Seed Project's Ecological Programs Manager, Anna furthers the organization's educational mission to inspire people to return native plants to the Maine landscape and works with partners to demonstrate ecology in action. Anna was most recently senior horticulturist at Native Plant Trust's Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts, where she designed and installed native plant gardens, managed interns and volunteers, and taught community members ways to incorporate native plants in their own gardens. With a BA in Human Ecology from College of the Atlantic and an MS in Ecological Design from the Conway School, she brings with her a deep knowledge of native plant ecology, horticulture, conservation, and ecological landscape design. So, for everyone who's used to our monthly meeting layout, everything that we typically do in the beginning will be at the end because we want Anna to have her time to shine. I'm going to stop sharing. Anna, you are welcome to take over sharing. And I'm
Okay, great. And can everyone see my screen all right? Great. Just gonna close out a window here. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm really excited to be partnering, to have Wild Seed Project be partnering with this chapter of Wild Ones, and that you've had such a great turnout. That's really great to hear. I'm coming from Portland, Maine, which is in southern Maine. And I just, in case you are a little less familiar with what we do at Wild Seed Project, I'll give you a little bit of background and information before we begin. So the goal of Wild Seed Project is to build awareness about the vital importance of native plants, and to provide people with the tools to restore biodiversity in their own communities. So we understand that, people have all different types of living situations. Sometimes you don't have land of your own. You might have a small front stoop or steps where you can put some native plant containers or a porch. Some people do have their own land. And I think, the combination of private lands and public lands are a place where we really see that native plants need to be brought back. And we educate the public about the importance of native plants through our educational programs, walks, talks, and workshops like this, as well as our annual publication. We recently put out a guide on native ground covers, and you'll actually get to see some of the illustrations in this guide of some of the guilds of ground covers that we've put together with our lovely artist, Vanessa Nesvig. And we also encourage people to grow native plants from seed. That's part of the Wild Seed Project. We think that, growing native plants from seed encourages these plants to be able to have populations that are healthy and resilient and can adapt to all of the different potential negative effects of climate change, like drought and flooding and heat that we've been seeing, especially in the last number of years. So before we begin today's session, Wild Seed Project, at all of our programs, we like to make sure that we are able to acknowledge the land of Maine. And this may not apply to you directly if you don't live in Maine, but I think that we all can take something from it. So in Maine, I think we want to just make sure that before we begin today's session, we'd like to recognize that we are leading this class from unceded Wabanaki territory that we now call Maine. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the people of the Dawn, the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy, and to honor their relationship to the plants and animals and other beings that have been threatened and displaced through centuries of settler colonialism. When we talk of bringing native plants back to our landscapes, we are talking about decolonizing our practices, our priorities, and our perspectives. Through centuries of industrialization, urbanization, and commodification, we have dominated the land and bent nature to our will. The work we do at Wild Seed Project is necessary precisely because of the impacts of ongoing violence of colonization. We hope you'll join us in striving to learn about the land we inhabit and support the Indigenous-led efforts to protect land, water, plants, and creatures among us, wherever you may live. So now I'd love to start chatting about native plant guilds and share with you some of my excitement for thinking about native plants and groupings like guilds. You might have heard the word guild if you ever learned about the Three Sisters. The Three Sisters is what I'd like to think of as kind of the original guild. It is something that of various Native American tribes, especially the Iroquois, we have a lot of information from them, have practiced growing plants in these very particular groupings for productivity of food. So a mound of corn, beans, and squash is a really traditional Native American guild, and it's known as the Three Sisters. So in the Three Sisters, these plants work, in synchronicity together. What they produce is kind of greater than the sum of the individual parts, and they all have a role to play. There's the corn, which provides the pole and provides edible fruits, of course, and a real base for the subsistence of the diet, a lot of the calories of the diet and nutrition. And then there's beans, which trellis up the pole of corn, and they help improve the soil by fixing nitrogen and adding nutrients to the soil. Then they produce an edible fruit as well. And then on the ground layer, there's the squash that has large leaves that shade and cool the ground, keeping moisture retained and producing another edible fruit. So the three plants together are also thought to be kind of a complete nutritional source, so that you could have all of your dietary needs met with these three plants, along with other species that would add more micronutrients, but these provide at least the major macronutrients that you need. When thinking about the word guild, it definitely recalls this kind of productive grouping of plants. And there are, other types of practices like edible forest gardening or permaculture you may have heard of, that employ this kind of thinking where you're grouping plants together to serve different functions and different roles. And I love the idea of using the word guild because of that. We originally, when we were kind of thinking through this for our ground cover guide, we actually thought that we would use the word plant palette, but we were moved away from that by the idea that when you think about a painter's palette, it's all the different colors, which is really nice to think of, but It is more of a kind of a design term, and it's something you may have heard of if you've ever embarked on doing a design or a plan of your own, where you come up with a list of plants that might work for a particular place, and you have your reasons why. I think the word palette does kind of make me think about a painter's palette, and then that being kind of purely the aesthetics, whereas a guild makes me think about a grouping that of pieces that work together in a very particular function. So there's another way you can, we can create, if we think about the idea of these kind of productive guilds, we can kind of think about other native plants that might work together to be more productive. And so the Three Brothers is not a true Native American guild. It's something that I actually spent some time working at Native Plant Trust in their botanical garden called Garden in the Woods. And some of the horticulturists there put together different groupings of plants to mimic this type of guild. In a container, we'd combined things like American groundnut, which is a pea family plant as well. It fixes nitrogen in the soil. And then sunchoke, which provides that kind of tall pole-like plant for the American groundnut to trellis up. Sunchokes have an edible tuber, and so do American groundnuts. So they're kind of nice together because of that. And then wild strawberry provides the ground cover in this scenario, and edible fruits. So I really like all of these plants together. I think they'd work really well, but I would definitely advise putting them together in a container because they are very vigorous plants. Now, they can all be used in different ways on their own. Wild strawberry makes a really lovely ground cover underneath the feet of taller plants or, like things like shrubs and taller perennials. And it also makes a great lawn alternative that you can eat. And it tolerates mowing. If it's mowed more frequently, it actually tends to be a little, it shares space with others a little bit better, but it will kind of be the dominant ground cover if you put that into most kind of sunny spaces. It can handle a little bit of shade as well, and a wide range of conditions like moisture and really well-drained soils at the same time. So these three plants are beautiful together, but when I'm thinking of putting together native plant guilds, I'm not necessarily only thinking about using edible productive species in that way. I think we can think about incorporating groups of plants that work well together into our different design spaces and natural spaces in order to make the design component of native plant gardening a little bit easier, because when you do go to the nursery, you end up with so many different choices. I don't know about you, but I tend to be somebody who is a little bit of a plant hoard, and I'll pick out a plant just because I see it and I like it. And at nurseries, I think, the new showy cultivar is often pushed as, the new thing that you have to have. It's improved. But I think that's not always the case. Oftentimes, the cultivars of native plants, they do have setbacks in terms of their ecological value and lack of genetic diversity, since they're cloned plants to maintain those specific traits that we might like. So we can go to the nursery more prepared with our plant list, like a shopping list, and think about what we want to get. And I think that's a nice way to approach it when you can. To think about grouping native plants, I definitely feel inspired by planting like a forest, thinking about it from the perspective of a forest system. Because in a forest, all these different layers exist, and the canopy is really important for shading and cooling the ground, and intercepting the leaves of the canopy are the first things to intercept the rainwater as it comes down, and it can slow down that water as it hits the ground, which is really important in our cities and suburbs. And in the kind of subcanopy or the flowering understory trees. In the spring, they'll flower prolifically. They'll provide another layer of vegetation to stack underneath the taller canopy trees. The shrubs and the woody plants overall provide a lot of structure in the garden, and they're important for birds finding cover and forage throughout the growing season, and then even into the winter, the birds that don't migrate. And then as you get into the ground layer, you have various layers of herbaceous native plants like ferns and taller plants, as well as the true ground covers like mayapple and wild strawberry and barren strawberry and green and gold and things like that. So I think that all those layers serve a very particular role in the garden and in the forest. And then even beneath the actual living plants is their roots, which are soaking up tons of water, and also, exchanging messages and nutrients via a rhizomial network. So the mycorrhizal network is really significant in especially older forests for the health of the forest. And you can start to cultivate that by not cultivating, by leaving your leaves a little bit more so that they can break down and provide some cover and protection for various species of moths and butterflies that at some point in their life cycle will spend time in the leaf litter, oftentimes over the winter in their cocoons, or frogs under the leaves in the soil, other amphibians like salamanders, and even bumblebees. Some bumblebees actually spend a portion of their lives in the leaf litter or the soil layer. So all these components are really essential, and I think make for a much more healthy planting. Just to give you an idea of what some of these species are. This is a scene at Garden in the Woods, and there's flowering dogwood in kind of like the sub canopy. There's oaks in the upper canopy, pink shell azalea for some of the shrubs that are here, and then mayapple are those kind of broad leaves with some lady fern as well, and a number of other species. So when thinking about building your guild and putting together your grouping of plants, I think the first thing to start with is assessing your site conditions, because you want to get an understanding of where plants will truly thrive without having to change the site for the plants. So you don't need to amend your soils necessarily. You don't need to cut down trees to provide more light. You can find plants that actually fit well within, if you have shady conditions, in dry, well-drained soils, or acid soils, or you have consistently moist soils or wet soils in the sun. You can find a wide range of native plants that will fit into all those different types of conditions and pick from there. So I like to get inspiration from natural habitats to think about, what are the site conditions of natural habitats and what suite of plants are growing there. I think that's a really great way to build a guild, and you can use your time in hiking and exploring natural areas, as well as other gardens, to think about what plants work together aesthetically and functionally. And you can fill all the vertical layers in the landscape. That's another piece of choosing your plants. You want to make sure that you choose your canopy trees if you have the room for them. If you don't, you can, use your understory trees or shrubs as kind of the canopy. Or if it's kind of an open area, you can use your tall perennial plants like Joe Pye weeds and ironweed and sunflowers as the kind of canopy. Then you can group plants together with similar growth rates. I think that, it can be a challenge also figuring out some of the different habits of plants as you're getting to know native plants as a new native plant gardener, there's just so much to learn, but I think this is one essential piece. So if you learn, whether a plant grows vegetatively and spreads maybe from its rhizomes or spreads by seed, and then what that might mean for the plant, like a black-eyed coneflower spreads by seed. And so in a full sun condition, with some open soil, it will spread more rapidly. So you want to match plants with it that are going to be able to work well with it and not be overwhelmed by that, coneflower, for example. Other ways that you can kind of choose your guild are to plan for seasonal interest. And so choosing a plant that, blooms maybe in the spring, but has beautiful fall foliage, or like a winterberry holly that actually has berries that hang on through the winter. You can think about all the different elements of what's going to be beautiful and interesting for pollinators throughout the season. And then finally, I do think that this is important. The aesthetics are important because you want to think about what's going to be beautiful and inspiring to others so that they want to also plant native species in their own yards. So finding complementary textures and colors is one of the fun parts, the more artistic parts. Thinking about, putting plants together so that they do look like a garden instead of just not necessarily like a walk through the woods or a natural habitat. But at the same time, you can find really cool plant combinations that look beautiful together by looking in the woods. So I'll give you some examples of those things. So this is one way. I know that seasonal interest can be kind of an overwhelming topic. So thinking about, I like to make spreadsheets for, I am a spreadsheet thinker, and not everybody is, but I think thinking about what the plants are doing all through every month of the year. I have only May through November on here, but you can get the idea from this list. And then there's not all native plants here. There are some cultivars, or nativars here. But it's basically, this is what a designer would think of as a plant palette. But I would think of it as a native plant guild. So plants that work well together and that grow in the same habitat and soil and light conditions. And then thinking about what's going to be interesting and beautiful to look at, as well as nutritious or important for pollinators and other wildlife at different times of the year. So you can think about it that way. So now I think what I'll do is kind of run us through some of the various conditions that you might have. I've gone through, I think about 6 conditions that you might have, sunny, dry, sunny, medium soils, and then those wet places, as well as all the shady conditions that you might have, so that no matter what condition you do have on your site, you can find a really nice native plant palette or guild to work there. And here's a really kind of pared down list. It's usually, I think, for each condition, I have about 15 species. There's so many more species that could work well for all these different conditions, and a lot of the species overlap and work well in multiple conditions. So I just did my best to kind of find some of my favorite plants that would grow in the canopy, that would maybe be able to stack underneath the canopy trees, small, medium, and large trees, and then the shrubs that really, create the bones or the structure of the space, and then the ground layer, which is also composed of multiple layers. You have your tall perennial plants down to your ground hugging plants. So for sunny and dry conditions, here's a nice grouping that you can choose. And I think what I would do is pick, if I have an area where I know that I can have a canopy tree, I would pick at least one canopy tree. Oftentimes I'd start with an oak, because thinking about some of the species that, host the most wildlife value is a really good place to start. Like oaks are actually some of our most beneficial plants that we have in North America for wildlife. They, depending on where you live, they can host up to upwards of 400 to 500 plus species of moths and butterflies as larval hosts. So those caterpillars of those species actually eat oak leaves. And oftentimes you don't see all these caterpillars on the trees because they're up in the canopy. And then a lot of times they're off pollinating flowers when they're adults, or they have very short lives like a lot of moths do as adults, and they're just there to reproduce and fly off. So, but oaks, you know, they're very important sustenance for a lot of mammals because of their acorns are, you know, very caloric rich and nutrient rich. And that just within their leafy branches, they provide places for cover and nesting and forage. So they provide a lot for a lot of creatures. I think that if you've heard of Doug Tallamy, who's a researcher and entomologist at the University of Delaware, you probably have heard about oaks being one of our kind of keystone species. Now, you could also think of several other tree species which are keystone species, like the cherry, the poplar, the birch, and the and maples as well. So, you know, I think if you plant one of those species, it could be as a shrub or as a tree, that a native species of one of these groups of plants, then you're definitely going to be hosting lots and lots of wildlife. So, you know, after picking a canopy tree, you can think about what small trees or shrubs or other, you know, medium trees might work kind of underneath that to stack and layer in there, and then what works on the ground layer. So you could pick, you know, 5 species from this list and make a really nice grouping. I like my guilds to be somewhere between 3 and 7 species. Oftentimes 3 species is not quite enough. So for a sunny, dry spot, a nice small tree or shrub is the beach plum. And while it's related to cherries, which is a prunus, so they actually are very important for wildlife as well. They're a keystone kind of larval host by hosting upwards of 300 plus species of moths and butterflies on their leaves. And they also, of course, produce this delightful edible fruit. It tastes just like a regular kind of cultivated plum. It's just smaller. And it's about the size of a small cherry. The flowers actually in the spring are, you know, really great for pollinators. And they are just really great wildlife plants overall, because in their natural habitats, which is sand dunes and sandy beaches, these trees are actually more like kind of rambling, suckering shrubs and form real dense thickets. So they provide a lot of places for small mammals and birds to hide and then forage. And I think they would work really, really well as an urban tree, or shrub. So you could plant them, say here, this is actually in this really tight spot next to a driveway on a south-facing side of the house. And this tree is actually espaliered a little bit more so that it, you know, when you drive in through this driveway on the right, your car doesn't hit the branches, but it's beautiful kind of like on this flattened espaliered plane up against a house. And then you can fit kind of other ground covers beneath it. Some of those things that you might pair with the beach plum are the shrub bayberry, which also grows on the coastal sand plain, as well as near the edges of ponds. So this is a really tough shrub that is tolerant of a wide range of conditions, but can really handle those tough, dry conditions and can handle salt spray too. So it's kind of, you know, leathery, glossy leaves are very tolerant of salt spray, which salt spray and from either could be from an ocean breeze or from, you know, the plow going by and you know, putting tons of salt onto it. So it could also be a really nice kind of urban plant. And it has these blue waxy berries that are fragrant. The leaves are fragrant too, and really attractive to a lot of different bird species. I've especially seen lots of waxwings on bayberry. And people used to actually, I think they still do in some places, boil down the berries to make candle wax, and it smells delightful. It's kind of like, I would describe it as a spicy kind of bubblegum scent. But it makes also a very nice informal hedge because it's semi-evergreen. The leaves stay on the plant for a really long time and usually don't fall off the plant until kind of late winter or so. And oftentimes like the wind will take it off eventually, or sometimes the leaves stay on almost until the new leaves are ready to start growing. They do take a little bit longer to leaf out in the spring than a lot of our shrubs do because the leaves from last year stay on so long. But they sucker really well, and you can cut this plant back, actually, this shrub back to a ground cover. So if you cut it back kind of more repeatedly, it will, keep regrowing and suckering and will make really beautiful ground cover, but it also makes a nice screening shrub at the same time. What you could put underneath the beach plum or the bayberry are plants that tolerate, those dry, rocky or gravelly soils in full sun. That could be in a hell strip, which is that spot between, that really tough spot between the sidewalk and the road. It's really hot and dry. Pussy toes, there's lots of different species of pussy toes, and they bloom in the spring and are a really lovely host plant for the American lady butterfly. They have this kind of soft textured leaf that really hugs the ground and is a really, it's kind of a blue-green color. So it stands out really nicely with more needle-leaved plants like the flax-leaf stiff aster, and then the bright green leaves of the butterfly milkweed. Milkweeds, of course, host the monarch butterfly, but are also really powerful pollinator magnets. When they're in flower, they host, lots and lots of bees on their flowers and butterflies. And then the flax-leaved aster blooms late in the season like other asters. So it's nice and upright. It's great for kind of a tidy garden. So all these plants would work really well in a small sunny garden, like a courtyard or a rock outcrop too. And flaxleaf stiff aster has, just tons and tons of flowers that cover it in late summer, early fall. And then once the flowers go by, they have these puffy seed heads, and the plant actually has really lovely fall color too, salmons and pinks and oranges and greens. So for a dry, sunny area, you could also, if you were to, try to cover a really tough, dry slope, or maybe if you were pulling out invasive species like bittersweet or, even something like black swallowwort, replacing those kind of areas where you've removed a lot of those invasive plants, or if you have, just a really a slope that's prone to erosion, planting species like this that are very vigorous and will take up space is really an important thing to do, replacing those species with native species that are just able to hold their own with all the competition and with a really tough spot. So wild strawberry is one of those plants. It will grow in really tough, dry conditions, though it doesn't always. It can grow in kind of moist, shady woodlands too. Partridge pea is one that I use a lot in plantings when I'm first trying to kind of cover the ground initially and establish a planting. It's in the pea family as well, and it is an annual actually. So it kind of acts as a native cover crop. And I like to use it in new meadows and new sunny areas where there's open soil. You can just seed that one directly into the soil. And I would do it in the fall. And then it will come up and flower the next year by midsummer and have lots and lots of blooms and lots of pollinator value and beauty, while your slower growing species are still getting established. Aromatic sumac is actually a shrub. The shrub can get 10 feet tall or so. you may be more familiar with the aromatic sumac, the low grow variety, which is a real ground cover. But this one can be used as a ground cover too, and it can be cut back a lot like the bayberry, or it can be left to grow taller. And then Pearly Everlasting is another vigorous native plant that is also a host for the American lady butterfly. And it's called Pearly Everlasting because the white flowers with little yellow centers do look like they persist kind of throughout, from midsummer throughout late summer and a good portion of the growing season, because the flowers are kind of papery and dry. And then as they go to seed, they kind of maintain that same bright color and shape. And so it just looks beautiful for a long portion of the season with that kind of bluish, fuzzy foliage like the pussy toes. It's in the same plant family. Moving on to sunny and medium moisture, it's really, this is the probably the niche that is easiest to fill. Sunny average soil gardens, you can put such a wide range of species here. So I think that this one was kind of the easiest for me to find plants that work for it, because the conditions are not necessarily tough for most species. A lot of species enjoy a wide range of a lot of sun and can handle kind of that middle of the road moisture level in the soil. So here's the list, and I'm going to talk more about some of the individual species in this list. I think that this presentation is a really nice resource. So what I'll do is send the PDF of my slides to Jessie after this presentation, and you'll be able to, hopefully you can send those off to people, and you'll all be able to have this as a resource so you can look back through it if you need. Because I think having plant lists like these is really helpful. And if you want other plant lists, we do have lots of plant lists on our website too. So we have a comprehensive plant list that goes through many, many native species, not every single one, but it's almost comprehensive, and all the different types of conditions that you can look for to grow those native plants. As well as a nice list for what to plant after you remove invasive species, those vigorous plants that I was just talking about that would be great replacements for invasive species. So in a sunny kind of open area, I think black cherries grow really well. You might associate a black cherry as being kind of a weedy tree because it does kind of spread around and pop up in a lot of different spots. But I think that this is such a ecologically valuable tree that we shouldn't overlook it. It hosts, upwards of 300 plus species of moths and butterflies. And I'll just kind of talk about the life cycle of one particular moth that I've had the pleasure of raising when I was a horticulturist at Garden in the Woods. And it's just such a beautiful moth. The Cecropia silk moth is a giant silk moth. It's probably our largest silk moth in the Northeast, and it gets to be the size of a small bird. So about, maybe 4 to 6 inches across. The females tend to be a little bit bigger than the males. But you don't see this moth very often because the adults fly at night for the most part, or in the wee hours of the morning. So the males will fly to the females using pheromones to find them, and up to a couple miles away. Then they lay their eggs on the host plant, and some of their only host plants are certain native trees. A lot of our moths and butterflies and other insects are very host specific, and our native plants are oftentimes, certain individual species of our native plants are oftentimes one of the only species that they'll be able to utilize for food for their larvae. So that's one of the big reasons why native plants are so important, because we may have other things like Russian sage or dandelions or non-native mints that provide a lot of forage for bees and other species, but oftentimes those are more generalist species. And we have native generalist plants, but those specialized plants that have special associations with our native insects are important to keep in the landscape, so those insects continue to have habitat. So the Cecropia silk moth caterpillars go through several instar stages, and they get to be really big and chunky. They're really cool looking with these kind of spikes on their bodies with red and yellow and blue kind of balls at the end of them. And they will eat lots and lots of cherry leaves throughout the season and then pupate by kind of late summer. These particular species actually pupate and spin their cocoons while hanging on a branch. They'll attach their cocoons to the branch of the tree. But there are other native moths that will, drop down from the trees that they were feeding in once they are ready to pupate, and will spin their cocoons in the leaf litter. So for an example of this would be the Luna moth is one of those that does that. And when they're in the leaf litter, they're very vulnerable. So, if a mower or blower go by, they could be, sliced up and gone. So their life cycle could be completely interrupted there, and they might not be able to reproduce another generation. So, thinking about planting a tree is important, but also how you manage the landscape around the tree is just as significant. So black cherries also have spring flowers that support lots of pollinators. And then, of course, the cherries themselves, which the animals, the birds and the mammals go after, like crazy. And people can eat them too. They're edible. They can be tasty, and it really depends on the individual tree. I found you can go to one tree and it'll taste kind of bitter or astringent, and then you can go to another tree and it's really, really good. So I don't know why that is, but it seems like the animals don't seem to discriminate tree by tree. Another plant in the same family as a cherry is the serviceberry. And I think this is one of my favorite understory trees or small trees because it's so versatile and tolerant of a wide range of conditions. There's many different, species of serviceberry, but the ones that are kind of more tree-like are this species, the Emelanchier canadensis. There's Emelanchier arborea, which is a very tree-like species. And then there's the lavis, Emelanchier lavis, which is the smooth serviceberry. And these all can be kind of more tree-like and have maybe be pruned to have one main stem, or they can have multiple stems and, limbed up to be more tree-like. So you can actually fit more vegetation underneath it and stack and layer all of that native plant biomass below it. But they can also be these beautiful shrubs. They have this kind of nice, whimsical, irregular form. And the stems get nice and wavy, and they have, as they mature, they have this really smooth bark with these kind of stripes on them. They're kind of thought of as a harbinger of spring in the Northeast because they are one of the first native trees to bloom. And when they're in bloom, they have these white flowers that kind of look like they could be, some other flower in the apple or cherry family, but they're distinguished because they have kind of, as they're in bloom, their leaves are still unfolding. So usually their leaves are kind of half folded when they're in bloom. And so you can see that along the road sides and along wetland margins, especially. But this is in a city right in Portland, down the street from my house. This plant is growing in just a sidewalk planting container, and it's just fruiting like mad, and it's really beautiful. When it's in fruit, it fruits kind of late June, early July. The birds just go after it like crazy. So oftentimes you don't get to see that many fruits on it because the birds eat them right away. But if you get a chance to taste them yourself, they taste kind of like a small plum or cherry. They can be kind of cherry-like. Some people say they have like a bitter almond flavor too. I tend to, they taste kind of like a plum, and they're really, really tasty if you can get them. Like, you can't stop eating them. So at the feet of those plants, I think you could plant a wide range of species, but a ground cover I would recommend would be the running groundsel, which is a plant that can handle also a wide range of conditions from dry shade to moist sun. And when it flowers, it gets to be about a foot off the ground with these sunny daisy-like flowers, but it's a real ground hugger when it's not in flower as well. Its foliage will really blanket the ground, and it'll spread by rhizome and runner. And then it also spreads by seed a little bit too, because it does put off a lot of seeds after it goes to seed. If you cut it back right when the flowers are going by, then you can often have like a regrowth of flowers, which is really neat. It's kind of like deadheading it. And then it grows really well with, I think, other plants like the red columbine. Red columbine can grow in kind of moist sun or medium to dry shade. It also likes to grow in kind of rocky outcrops, and I think it goes nicely with pussy toes too, but it can go well with like kind of these moist sunny plants too. Clustered mountain mint is taller than both of these and does provide a real ground cover, and it spreads by rhizome, so it will really spread out over time, but it's just one of the most fragrant plants and is a real bee magnet. The leaves of mountain mint smell very different from other species of mints. They have their own quality, and they just one of those smells you can't get enough of if you like mints. So in sunny and medium or wet soils, you have probably the most competition from weeds. So you do have to have native plants that can really hold their own amongst all that weed competition. And what I would choose for a canopy tree for a wet, sunny spot is the swamp white oak. It's a beautiful oak that I think is kind of underutilized, especially in our urban areas. I got to attend a webinar by Tim Boland, who is a horticulturist at Polly Hill Arboretum in Martha's Vineyard, and he is kind of an oak specialist. He gave a presentation all on oaks, and he was saying that the swamp white oak is probably one of our best urban trees, actually, because it can handle, even though it's a swamp loving plant, it can handle drought too. And that's often the case with a lot of our wetland plants. They can handle both inundation and drought. And I think that would make it really great for kind of a rain garden setting or a bioswale or somewhere that is seasonally wet, but also can dry out in the middle of the summer. Its fall foliage is just incredible and is very golden in color. And I really like, in New England, at least, we definitely have the kind of first wave of fall color with the maples and the birches and ashes and a lot of those deciduous trees that turn beautiful different shades. And then we have kind of a second wave with the oaks and the hickories because they're some of the later trees to turn in the fall. And I imagine that's probably the case in Pennsylvania and New York State as well. And sunny to medium and wet sites, I think underneath a taller canopy or on their own, you could probably have sweet bay magnolia. That one is just an outstanding native tree, ornamental native tree with these large saucer shaped flowers. And the flowers actually have kind of a lemon scent when you can go up to them. They attract lots of pollinators as well. And sweet bay magnolia is tolerant of being inundated. So I feel like I'm talking about rain gardens in this group a lot more, because a lot of these plants can handle, having wet feet for a good portion of the season, and then their roots not their roots, but the soil drying out a little bit later on. Winterberry holly is one that actually, will thrive in wetlands. You see it kind of growing most prolifically in wetlands, but in an average garden soil, it'll thrive as well. And this one is tolerant of both shade and sun. So it will definitely flower and produce more fruits in the full sun though. So if you want to have a real beautiful piece of winter interest, it's great to plant winterberry holly. And you'll often see, you know, even snow-topped fruits. But I would say that these fruits tend to persist throughout the winter into late winter. And depending on, you know, what wildlife you have around you, sometimes the squirrels just eat them all right away. But I often find many years that the birds will kind of hold out and not eat the winterberry holly fruits until they've gone through like a freeze and thaw and their sugars have concentrated a little bit more. And also a lot of birds, you know, will really eat mostly insects throughout the growing season. And then as the temperatures cool, then that's when the insects, you know, their levels drop a little bit more, the birds will turn to seeds and like in coneflowers and other native plants, and then the fruits on persistent, you know, fruiting shrubs. So viburnums and winterberry holly are just a few different groups of native plants that are really great to plant for the native birds that don't migrate south for the winter. You could probably make a whole guild out of like a bog inspired planting. And so in the understory of some of these trees and shrubs, you could plant a smaller shrub like Labrador tea, which is also a rhododendron. It has a beautiful another kind of bubblegum like fragrance, and things like white turtlehead, which is a host plant for the Baltimore checker spot butterfly, which the populations of that butterfly are definitely dropping. The Baltimore checker spot butterfly actually takes a couple growing seasons to complete its life cycle. So it will forage as a caterpillar on leaves of white turtlehead and just a few other host plants. And then it'll actually overwinter in the leaf litter as a caterpillar, which is even more of a vulnerable stage in its life cycle than overwintering as a cocoon or a chrysalis. And then it will actually kind of crawl up to its host plants in the following season and continue eating and gather enough energy to then pupate by kind of late spring, early summer, and then become a butterfly. So that really means that if you do want to have a butterfly, like the Baltimore checker spot or other checker spot butterflies, you definitely need to not remove your leaf litter, and you also need to plant their host plants so that they'll have something to eat as caterpillars. But white turtlehead is also great for bumblebees. Only bumblebees are really able to pry into those really tight-lipped petals. Large cranberry is a really nice one for kind of a ground cover in a wet spot. And that grows nicely with purple pitcher plant, which is a carnivorous plant. The marsh marigold is a really, really early blooming plant. It's probably one of our first blooming native wildflowers in wetlands. So at least in Maine, where I am, if you drive along the highways and roadsides, you'll often see in the ditches where there's kind of a more wet spot off the road, the just huge stands of marsh marigolds in bloom. And then cardinal flower is another one that grows really well, maybe not in a bog setting, but in a moist, sunny spot. So even if you don't have a true bog in your backyard, you can kind of replicate it with having some of these plants there. Now we're on to part to full shade and medium to dry soils. This can be a tricky niche to fill, especially because a lot of plants are not so shade tolerant, but we do have a large, portion of our native plants that are able to thrive in the shade and do best in the shade. If you want to learn more about shade tolerant plants, we have a really nice article on our website that's called Gardening in the Woodland Understory. So just search that if you go to kind of our search bar to read more about plants that thrive in the shade. But the shagbark hickory is, you know, one of our dominant native trees in New England, and it grows, you know, along with the oaks is another dominant, the red oaks is another dominant tree. In the forest in you know, the middle of the summer or the winter, you can really pick out a shagbark hickory by its really, really kind of huge plates of shaggy bark that are kind of lifting off the tree. It's also called shellbark hickory too. And it provides a lot of habitat and wildlife value, you know, even in the big, you know, crotches between the pieces of bark that are flaking off the tree. That's a place where a lot of bats actually are able to nest. The nuts are just a really important nutrient source for a wide range of mammals and people as well. And then, you know, the cavities of the tree, if it loses a branch and gets a cavity, you know, there's more places for nesting for birds and other animals. And this has a really nice kind of golden color in the fall too. So in part to full shade and medium to dry soils, it can be really hard to find very many shrubs that do well in shade, especially in kind of on dry soils on the drier side. So I think that maple leaf viburnum is probably one of my go-to plants for shade. It will thrive in moist soils too, but I find that it has a good tolerance for dry soils. And this one is, you know, beautiful at all times of the year. It has this kind of foamy, flat-topped cluster of flowers. Viburnums in general are really important for lots of insects, beetles, and flies and bees and other pollinators really go after the flowers. And then they have this really important fruit that's edible. Most viburnums, I think, are edible to people, though they're not necessarily the most fleshy or tasty fruit all the time, but they're really palatable to lots of animals. And the fall color of maple leaf viburnum is just lovely. It can range, you can see here, from kind of a purple to red, and oftentimes the veins are kind of the leaf are left a little bit lighter in color. And I really like this kind of combination, especially for a shady woodland understory. So Pennsylvania sedge, you might have already learned that creates a really nice kind of lawn alternative, but you can also use it kind of as a matrix planting through which other species can kind of grow. So I like having a basis of Pennsylvania sedge to kind of create like a nice fine textured backdrop and that kind of bright chartreuse color green. And then you can have the broadleaf sedge and other kind of broadleaf plants that can complement it. And to have a wide range of different flowers at different times of the year kind of incorporated in. Bowman's root is one of my favorite native wildflowers. It just has this kind of really beautiful mounded form. The flowers don't last a terribly long time, but when they're out, they're just these beautiful white star-shaped flowers on red stems. And then the fall color is really nice for Bowman's root. I do want to, note that if you grow Bowman's root in dry shade, if it does get exposed to more sun and it's dry, it will really burn out by the end of summer. But if it's kept in the shade, or if it's kept in a slightly more moist area when it's being hit by a little bit more sun, then it won't burn out the same way. Blue stem goldenrod is a lovely, dry shade loving goldenrod that's more well behaved for a garden. And goldenrods are another one of those kind of keystone plants for the herbaceous layer. So they host over 100 species of moths and butterflies on their leaves, and then they're a significant source of late season nectar and pollen for bees. In dry shade, or even this picture doesn't actually show up, but these plants will grow in dry shade or moist shade, or full sun, or part sun. So They can tolerate a wide range of conditions, but the kind of limiting factor for them is that they require acid soils. So that's the bunchberries, the Pennsylvania sedge, Canada Mayflower, and things like wintergreen. I noticed I find them growing on, rocky outcrops in the sun down to moist areas next to ponds that are, in full shade. So these plants can tolerate a lot. But I think this grouping of plants can be really helpful when planting under conifers, and there's little, nutrient availability and little moisture available for stuff to grow underneath them. I think conifers are some of the hardest places, to grow plants underneath. So getting into, the full to part shade and more medium moisture, you can grow a lot of really lovely plants in this kind of situation. So the basswood is a native tree that I think is one of our more shade tolerant canopy trees. And it's also known as a pollinator magnet, and basswood honey is kind of looked after as like one of the, most kind of searched out for honeys, because the bees, really go after the flowers. But you can see that the butterflies are attracted to the flowers too. You don't have a lot of canopy trees that have beautiful flowers like this that pollinators are attracted to. A lot of our canopy trees, like the oaks, are wind pollinated actually. So they're not supporting pollinators necessarily by being kind of pollinator plants, but they're supporting them by providing their larvae with something to eat, their leaves. But this one really does. And then in the understory of maybe a basswood, you could plant pagoda dogwood, which is a beautiful shaped understory tree that has these tiered branching structure. And it can really look like the Japanese pagoda, and that's why it's kind of called the pagoda dogwood. It's also called the alternate leaf dogwood. And it's dark, purple berries, which are in fruit now in Maine, are really looked after by birds. I think birds just go after them right away. So you often don't see the berries on the tree, but every now and then you can find a tree that has a lot of berries left on it, and they're beautiful. It was actually one of the main food sources at this time of year for the passenger pigeon, which is now extinct. And a shrub for a moist, shady spot would be flowering raspberry. It's a raspberry that does have edible fruits. They're a little bit like drier and not as juicy. They're a little seedier than the red raspberry or the blackberry, but they're still pretty tasty. And as long as the root zone is kept nice and cool and moist, they will have really tasty berries. But their flowers are just gorgeous. They're big and showy. And then they don't have prickles or spines like blackberries do. So I think there's a lot of really good reasons to grow them. They're suckering shrubs, so they are really good at kind of covering the ground. And one of our board members who lives in Damariscotta, Maine, actually was able to dig out Japanese knotweed on this slope that goes down to the Damariscotta River, and then replace it with flowering raspberry. And the flowering raspberry is actually taking over that spot. And the Japanese knotweed's coming back, but it's just not as vigorous as it was. So she'll still need to pull that every now and then, but the flowering raspberry is holding its own. So that's a really good one to plant after invasive species removal. In the understory, the ground layer of these trees and shrubs, you can plant moist and shade-loving plants like foam flower and phlox and spotted cranesbill and bluewood aster, as well as the zigzag goldenrod. So that covers, the spring and the fall, and provides a lot for pollinators as well. You could think of, moist, rich woodlands as places to plant some of those kinds of typical wildflowers that you think of for the woodland understory, like the foam flowers. And A fern that I like to highlight is the long beach fern. That has a really lovely texture and is a real good ground cover. And then I think we're in our last kind of condition category, and that's the shady spots with wet soil, which there's actually a lot of native plants that work well here. And you'll see some repeats of plants that work well in sunny, wet places here, because a lot of the plants that are tolerant of wet spots are also great with shade. So just to look at like a canopy tree, an understory tree, and a shrub together that would work really well for a shady wet spot. Let's look at the red maple. The red maple, you know, I think will grow in full sun and will not necessarily grow up in the shade of another canopy as well, but it will be the plant that creates the shade. And underneath the shade of the red maple, I think American holly would be a great one. American holly is another versatile plant that can grow in dry, shady spots, sunny spots, and then with wet feet too. And then sweet pepperbush is a summer blooming plant that's just so great for pollinators. I think, you know, great for people and pollinators because its flowers are just extremely fragrant. In the understory of shady, wet places, marsh marigold again will thrive. It really tolerates the shade, the kind of late summer shade that's cast by the deciduous trees once they leaf out, and those kind of taller perennial plants that can kind of help protect it a little bit from the harsh summer sun. So it benefits from, you know, nice sun in the spring when the deciduous leaves haven't kind of fully come out yet. And blue lobelia, even though most people would think of it as kind of a sun-loving plant, it's very shade tolerant. Also, you have just so many different ferns that would thrive in moist shade, including the cinnamon fern. That's the one I have highlighted here because it's just really beautiful with the fertile fronds of the cinnamon fern, which are the spore producing fronds, come up in the center of the ferns in the middle of the summer and look like cinnamon sticks. They're just very beautiful. But you could have royal fern and marsh fern, New York fern, and sensitive fern, which is also in that picture, all growing in shady, wet spots too. So thank you everyone for joining tonight. I'll definitely take answers and I'll scroll through some of our resource slides that we have. Of course, I'll remind you that I'm going to send this PDF out after the presentation. So all of these resources will be available to you. So don't worry if you can't catch them all here. But I'll land on this slide so that you can take a look at what our most recent publications look like and some of the different places on our website that you can go to find some really nice things to read. So shall I take questions from the chat box? I can read them aloud. Is that probably the best thing to do?
Would you like me to look through there and find them for you? How would that be helpful?
Yeah, that would be really helpful. I can do a little looking too, but yeah, there's a lot, it looks like.
Everyone was loving your spreadsheet. So that is wonderful. We're all going to steal that idea. Any suggestions on when to sow seed for plants that like to have cold followed by warm temperatures, columbine, sneezeweed, snakeroot, etc.? And should they be sown in a special area and transplanted in the spring, or sown where I intend to have them grow?
Oh, that's a good question. Cold followed by warm, I'm guessing that you mean that what the seed needs to germinate. So yeah, that's it sounds like you're on the right track. Our native seeds, most of them require a cold, kind of moist period that either is the winter that we have or mimics winter. So I think the easiest way to grow many of our native plants from seed is to sow them into either pots with just, average potting soil that's rich in organic matter, in compost, compost rich potting soil, into pots, like a good 4.5-inch square pot is what I use, but it could be a cut up milk jug or an old yogurt container with some holes in the bottom. Just make sure that it's a pot that has drainage holes and isn't too big. And you can sow them in right on top of the soil, and then put a little bit of sand on top of that seed to hold the seeds down during the heavy rains. And I like to use the amount of sand that I use is like to the thickness of the seed. So if it's something like lobelia, which has really fine dusty seeds, I'll just use a tiny sprinkling of sand, because you don't want to cover those up too much. They do need light to germinate. If it's something like a lupin seed, which is a little thicker, like a size of a pea, I'd use about 1/4 inch of sand. So that's a good rule of thumb. And you put those outside, actually, in an exposed area, not under the eave of anything and not under a roof, because you want the beet to be exposed to the sun and the rain and the snow and frost and heaving, in order to go through their kind of stratification process, which is the mechanism that breaks the dormancy of the seed. So many of our native species need several months of cold, moist, a cold, moist period in order to break their dormancy. And so a lot of them will actually germinate the following spring. You also want to protect them from rodents and other animals by covering them with a nice cloth, like a hardware cloth, which is like a screen mesh. And covering them, some people will cover them with rime, but I prefer not to, because you do want to make sure that the rain gets in. So that's my simple method. And we actually, every year we are starting to teach more seed sowing workshops. So look for some free seed sowing tutorials. If you visit the Wild Seed Project website or subscribe to our newsletter, you'll get kind of a heads up on those seed sowing tutorials and be able to watch us on screen sowing our seeds for the winter. So I like to sow them from mid-November through January. That's kind of the best window to sow them in.
Awesome. I know with our chapter, we have referenced Wild Seed Project when we taught about native seed sowing. So there are
That's great.
How to cope with rabbits and woodchucks. They chow down on many forbs that I'd love to grow. Butterfly milkweed seems to be a fave of the rabbits. Garden phlox, ditto for the woodchucks. And then someone else also asked what to do about chipmunks. They're burrowing directly under plants like Carpinus and red oak saplings, killing them.
Yeah, I think for that's a tough question, because it's just something we all contend with in our yards. But there's a couple of different things that you can kind of do to kind of help repel them, or keep them out. So for any woody plant that I'm growing, a shrub or a tree, I like to cage it or put like a fencing around it. So I use hardware cloth again, which you can get from the hardware store. It's basically like the 1/4 inch square hardware cloth is perfect. And you want to have it at least the height of the tree or shrub, but probably a little taller, so a deer couldn't reach its head in and eat the plant from there, and put that around the plant. And you do want to have it be big enough so as the plant expands, it has room to grow. So that's good for those woody plants. For the herbaceous ones, it can just be very tricky to keep the rabbits and the squirrels and other animals away, the voles too. So for springtime, especially if you're doing spring planting and getting things established, that's a really good time to spray like a repellent that is non-toxic, not toxic for people or animals. Something like Bobex, which is a brand, or Liquid Fence, another brand. And those just have, pungent, bad smelling things in them that will repel those animals. Spraying that kind of on the plants multiple times during the spring and then a little less frequently in the summer works well for the growing season to keep those animals away.
Excellent. I also find if I put my sensitive plants in the middle of a mint patch until they get established, I can keep critters away until they're strong enough, and then I can pull back the mint a little bit. You like disguise it.
Oh, wow. That's a cool idea. I never thought of that.
The drought here this summer makes me wonder if I should focus on extra drought tolerant plants. Are there resources that focus on such conditions?
Yeah, I think that I'm not thinking of particular resources off the top of my head, but I think that if you look for plants that tolerate dry conditions already, you know, those sandy, gravelly soils, and plants that grow on the coastal plain or in alpine zones, a lot of times are very drought tolerant. So it's just a matter of, yeah, doing a little bit of research like that. But I think there are lots of resources for xeriscaping. That's one way to kind of think about it, as, you know, using as little water as possible in your plantings. So I like things like bearberry, which is a really drought tolerant plant, and actually it doesn't like being watered too much. And some of the plants in the sunny dry category that I talked about, like planting leaf pussy toes. And another one that I love as a ground cover is the cinquefoil, the three-toothed cinquefoil. That's in the rose family, and that will grow on kind of alpine zones and on Mount Washington, or it will grow next to like a brick courtyard as a nice edger, and will tolerate kind of the heat that comes off the stone or brick that it's planted next to too.
Awesome. Everybody is thinking about drought. We actually chose our thought of the month for every chapter meeting. We have a thought of the month, and our thought of the month is gardening during drought. So we're going to talk about these things here in just a little bit. That's excellent.
That's great.
And I think that was everybody's questions. Thank you so much for such a great presentation. Lots of lists. You know how we love lists to work from. And plant communities and guilds. I learned a lot. I think everybody did. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Everybody is welcome to stay. We are going to move on with the rest of our meeting here. Let me see if I can get the right screen up. I think this should be it. Okay, so our chapter business, we have a balance in our chapter account of a little over $1,700. We should actually be getting a little more than that because we didn't receive our dues reimbursement yet. So we've got lots of money to spend on lots of projects I would love for us to do in the fall. We spent a little bit of money on the chapter picnic, which was so much fun. Rita and her kids were there. We went to Bondsville Mill Park, and we got a guided tour of all of the wonderful garden conditions that they have there and all of the native plants that they're putting in. I could have done a whole 10-page presentation on every garden they had there, but I limited it to just a few pictures. And if you go back to look at last month's presentation, you'll get to see a really great information about the gardens there. Rita's kids got to release a monarch butterfly that they had raised from a caterpillar. We got to see their picturesque gardens where they kind of invite people in to take pictures. The winged sumac was blooming. We got to see clear-wing butterfly or hummingbird moths visiting flowers as we walked by. We played a game of match the caterpillar to the butterfly to the host plant, and Rita's son was so amazing at it. He not only could match the caterpillar to the butterfly, which turned into the silver spotted skipper, but then like a moth magician, a silver spotted skipper literally flew over to his finger right after he made that connection of those three interactions. And it was so funny. He was like the moth whisperer. So we had a snack together. We enjoyed the grounds. And then my daughter and my husband and I went on a walk on one of the trails. We got to see lots of really fun things, little caterpillar eggs, and we were maybe pulling out some invasives that we saw while we walked by. And then Lindy, who's down here in this picture, she was a little further ahead on the trail than we were, and she decided, oh, this is like this fun log, I'm gonna jump on it. I come walking after her and stung by many yellow jackets whose home was in that log that she was jumping on. So I got to see our trail in reverse, running quickly away from that spot. But it was fine. They calmed down in a few minutes and we turned around and finished the trail, and it was lovely. So it was quite the exciting day there. And I highly recommend everybody go to Bonsville Park for all the trails and the yellow jackets. Again, if you don't jump on their house, they let you alone just fine. Our thought of the month, as promised, we are going to talk about gardening in drought. And Marilyn or Susan, I think, one of you is going to talk about this for us.
I am. The thought of the month was prepared for us by board member Marilyn Smith, but she asked me to read it because I think she has another event tonight. So, thought of the month, dealing with drought. Weather patterns are becoming increasingly extreme and erratic. We all have noticed that. As our climate changes, we will need to adapt our gardening practices. One of the predicted challenges is more intense and longer lasting drought. Welcome to the summer of 2022. The U.S. Forest Service says that native plants are adapted to the local climate and soil conditions where they naturally occur. These important plant species provide nectar, pollen, and seeds that serve as food for native butterflies, insects, birds, and other animals. Even the toughest drought-tolerant plants, however, need a chance to adapt. With good selection and placement, along with an appropriate establishment period, natives can grow in your landscape with little or no irrigation. But native plants are not drought-proof. You cannot plant any native in any situation and expect it to thrive without irrigation. For drought-tolerant landscaping, you need the right plant in the right place with the correct initial care. Plant drought-tolerant plants in the spring or the fall when water is more plentiful. This gives the plants a chance to build up their root systems for times when water is harder to come by. Many drought-tolerant plants have specific characteristics that help them minimize water loss and maximize water uptake. Some of these are a reduced leaf area, which means less water loss. Drought-tolerant plants may have small leaves or needle-like leaves. If they have large leaves, there may be deep indentations between the lobes to reduce the total leaf area. Drought-tolerant plants often have deep roots that enable them to pull in moisture from below the surface, deeper than other plants. They may have waxy stems and leaves, which slow water loss from transpiration. They may have fine hairs on the leaves to trap moisture at the leaf surface and reduce water loss through evaporation. Once these plants are established, gardeners can help them develop their drought tolerance through proper management. There are two important rules to foster drought tolerance. The first is to irrigate deeply, so that the water you're giving the plant penetrates deep down through the root system and the soil and hopefully meets with a stable moisture supply below. Water at the soil level, not overhead, and try to water early in the morning or in the evening to reduce evaporation. Second, irrigate as infrequently as possible. Carefully monitor your plants for stress such as wilted leaves or poor color. You might be tempted to water 2 or 3 times a week, especially during the summer. The regular and frequent irrigation that's used with conventional landscaping is not appropriate for drought-tolerant landscaping. If you water often, the plants will appear very healthy and vigorous, but they will be dependent on the continued irrigation because they will not develop a deep root system to cope with drought. They will decline rapidly if you stop watering. Plants native to our area are often incredibly adaptable to local weather changes and extremes. For many plants, this includes drought as well. Finding out about plants native to our area is a great way to start. Many of the best drought-tolerant plants may be familiar to you. Here's a short list, and you may recognize some of those characteristics that we talked about earlier, such as a smaller leaf area, hairs on the leaves, or waxy stems. The list includes purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, summer bloomer preferring full sun. Junipers are known for versatility in the landscape as well as toughness and drought tolerance. Beautyberry, Fialkoff americana, is a shrub with clusters of purple berries in the late summer, growing best in sun or light shade. I have to say I did not know beautyberry was drought tolerant, but now that I do, I'm going to cut way back on the watering of the two that I have. Black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta, is a showy, easy to grow biennial that self-sows on open soil. Columbine, Aquilegia canadensis, is our native columbine that grows in rocky woodlands and produces delicate red and yellow flowers in the spring. Now, columbine, if you have it, you probably noticed that it's practically died out by now, and that's not a problem. Columbine will disappear, especially in dry summers, and it'll pop back in the spring. Butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, is a relatively short and showy orange milkweed that, as you know, provides food and habitat for the monarch caterpillars, as well as nectar for the adult butterflies. Fragrant sumac, Rhus aromatica, is a plant that Anna spoke about in her presentation. A lot of people are familiar with the low spreading shrub, grow low, but the the straight species shrub is every bit as drought tolerant, and as she noted, can get up to 6 feet tall, although it can also be pruned lower. It's adaptable to many soil types. Mine are hard as iron. They grow through anything, and plants, especially in the lower pruned Rhus aromatica, can grow through them. So you can have a multi-layered guild with Rhus aromatica as your ground cover and low shrubs and grow things through it. It's a great plant. Many solidagos, goldenrods, are drought tolerant once they're established. The late summer blooms are invaluable for pollinators as they migrate south. Tickseed, Coreopsis verticillata, grows in dense bushy clumps, has attractive thread-like leaves and yellow flowers all summer. Harebell, Campanula rotundifolia, is a dainty but tough perennial with blue flowers over a long bloom period. And finally, sweet fern, Comptonia peregrina, another favorite of mine. It's a medium height deciduous shrub. It's not actually a fern, but it has fern-like glossy feathery leaves that are also pretty leathery, which contributes to its drought tolerance. It's another plant that you can grow things around and through. Thrives in full sun, in dry, infertile soil. That list of plants will be on our website, so you didn't have to write it all down. I should have told you that ahead of time, but that's our thought of the month.
Thank you so much, both Marilyn and Susan. And I wanted to share just a couple of pictures. None of these beds have received any extra water at all this year. And this is actually a bioswale during drought. So these are plants that were chosen to take up a lot of extra water. And as you can see, there are some of the plants that were listed as the drought tolerance, but some that weren't listed that you can have some really good success with. And this is the front bed. The Coreopsis is still amazing. This picture was taken today. So no extra watering. This was established last fall, and some plants were even put in this spring, and they're just going gangbusters with nothing extra.
Jessie, who's that Artemisia? I don't recognize Ludoviciana.
It is white sage, and it's actually more a Midwest plant.
Yes, it is. That's the tall one on the left, isn't it?
Yes, and that I cut back probably every month or two. I harvest because we use the sage in our honeybee keeping bee smokers. So yes,
oh, right.
A lot. Yeah.
But that's great.
It's the same plant that's used by indigenous tribes for ceremonies and things. You can find smoke sticks for sale in different shops.
Yeah, I had seen that recommended as drought tolerant, but I was thinking we couldn't grow it here because of the clayey soil, but apparently you can.
Yes, this is the only spot in my yard that is consistently dry, and it goes gangbusters there for sure.
I can give it lots of dry soil. Where did you get it? Can you get it locally?
No, I've purchased seed from either Prairie Moon or Prairie.
Oh, seed.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Okay, we can winter sow that.
Yep.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. And then we next have our tree of the month. Are you also doing that, Susan?
I am again prepared thanks to Marilyn Smith. She did all the research, so we appreciate that. The tree of the month is the swamp white oak, and that was, of course, one that Anna was featuring in her presentation, which I thought was pretty cool because we didn't know that. It's a lowland tree found in the eastern and central United States, a relatively large deciduous tree. You see that fantastic picture in the middle. That gets every big as a white oak. So that's pretty awesome. A broad, rounded crown and a short trunk, making it a really good shade tree for large spaces. The bark is gray to gray brown, exfoliating on the branches and the trunk. The leaves have 5 to 10 rounded, shallow lobes, and there's a picture of the leaves right there for leaf identification. With a lot of the oaks, you really have to stare at the leaves and also the acorn configuration. You can see that the acorns grow on a really long stem in pairs, and they're little short guys with a large round crown. So that's another way to figure out, if you see it growing in the wild, which oak is that, because they're tough to tell apart sometimes, the white oaks. Swamp white oak can survive in a number of habitats. It does prefer moist to wet, acidic soil with a high mineral content, but it's very adaptable to drier sites. Due to the root system, it's tolerant of areas that have spring flooding and then fairly dry summers, and we can have both. It has surprisingly good heat and drought resistance, but it's sensitive to soil compaction, to salt, and to air pollution. It can experience chlorosis, which is a yellowing of the leaves while the veins remain green if the soil is not acidic enough. This is a great tree for wetter or lower sites. Oak trees don't produce acorns until they're 20 to 30 years old. The acorns of swamp white oak are non-dormant, meaning that they germinate right after they fall. If you're growing them from seed, the acorns should be planted as soon as they're collected in the fall. Acorns, of course, are eaten by woodpeckers, blue jays, songbirds, wild turkeys, ducks, and geese, as well as small mammals and black bears. Oak trees, of course, as Anna mentioned, support a wide variety of Lepidoptera. They're one of the keystone species. This tree is mildly resistant to damage by deer. I don't have any personal experience of that, being the resident deer park around here. I haven't tried it, but I've got other oaks that come up from seed, and I don't know who they are, but the deer leave them alone. So hopefully they would leave this one alone. Traditionally, the inner bark of swamp white oak was used in the leather tanning industry and to produce an important yellow dye. Native Americans used it to treat a wide variety of ailments. Native Americans and colonists also used the nuts for food after the tannins were removed. So don't go off and eat acorns or even try to make acorn flour, because it has to be treated and roasted and I think washed to get rid of the tannins first. That said, roasted acorns have been ground and used as a coffee substitute. This is one of the more important white oaks for lumber production, and in recent years has become a popular landscaping tree due to its relative ease of transplanting. So Marilyn, thanks so much for putting that together.
Wonderful, thank you. And I can attest that if a rabbit comes and chops off the top of your baby swamp white oak, it will thrive and grow twice as big the next year, at least when it's under a foot tall when that happens. So far, so good.
Also, all of these canopy trees, which I didn't really think about, apparently can be coppiced and maintained as smaller understory trees. So if you don't have a clear 2 acres to grow these large oaks or the tulip poplars or the shagbark hickories, a lot of them can be trained to stay small, meaning that you can still have the keystone abilities of these great trees without having an 80-foot tall tree in your yard.
I think the only difference, which we wouldn't be able to tell anyways, was it won't live to be 500 years old. It might only live to be 200 years old. But I think that, yeah, it will do what we want it to do in our lifetime for sure.
Yeah, and I think the English have a long history of coppicing trees. I don't know what impact it has on the lifespan of the tree, but if anybody's interested, there's probably a lot of research in the English literature about which trees coppice well, at least native trees over there, and how to do it, etc. Neat opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. I know that Aaron, one of our members in Phoenixville, is compassing a lot of things because she has a smaller property, but wants to have a lot of biodiversity. So she might be a good case study for us to follow over the coming years to see.
The beach plum that Anna talked about too was one that she essentially coppiced, and it still produced a lot of flowers and fruit.
Yeah, those are good examples for sure.
But that's a small tree anyway, so.
Right. But I mean, if you're taking an 80-foot tree down to a 25-foot tree, you know, that's maybe the equivalent ratio of, I don't know.
But you have to do it gently year by year, not all at once.
Right.
I would assume.
Right. Okay, some of our upcoming opportunities, the Master Watershed Stewards Native Tree and Shrub Sale is happening now. Check out their website for their availability. They have 1, 2, and 3 gallon size containers. Here's the list of the things that they're offering this year. One of our members had emailed asking if we, as a chapter, were going to put together a sale of woodies this time around, and I don't know, we didn't really talk about it. I'm open to thoughts if we want to try and do that in the next month or so and get an order into Octoraro, we could do that. If we want to wait till spring, we can do it. I'm open to really whatever Susan and Marilyn and Audrey will have to say about it, because we as board members kind of do the forward work of collecting the orders and getting the things. So we can talk about that. But if we decide not to do a plant sale, here is an opportunity to get a lot of the great things that you might want and support another good organization. Later in August, the Butterfly Festival is happening at Colonial Gardens outside of Phoenixville. They have made a commitment to offer more native plants there, so it would be a great opportunity to support them and their move towards trying to get more native plants. If you want to go to that event, Bondsville Mill Park is always looking for volunteers. They have native plant gardening volunteers. I think it's on Saturdays and Mondays, maybe this is Sundays.
Yeah, it's Monday. Sorry, not Sundays.
Yeah, no, that's okay. But you're always welcome to check that out. You can learn a lot while you're there, and it's just a lovely place to be. Bowman's Hill has lots of opportunities through August and September. You can check out their website and register for their events. Next, the Lancaster Conservancy has an upcoming event that's free, so that sounds fun. Mount Cuba Center, a class fall garden care for wildlife is coming up in September. And then the BioBlitz, Rita, is that MCC? I know that is Montgomery County, but what is that? Do you know?
MCC, it's a nonprofit organization. It's called Mennonite Central Committee, and they do a lot of things, but one thing that they've done is that they've transformed all of their garden beds to native plant gardens, and that was done by Earthbound Artisans. So my friend Katrina, she manages that, and I volunteer on Thursdays to like take care of the, weeding and all of that stuff. And they're hosting a BioBlitz in September. And a nature fest. There's going to be music and fun activities, all nature related.
And you said Mennonite, what again?
Mennonite Central Committee.
Central Committee, okay. I'm taking notes here. Okay, excellent. And then PA Native Plant Society has some upcoming events. Linda will be talking for them in 2 different venues if you're in those areas, both in Mannheim, but she is super knowledgeable. It looks like they're going to have Hungry Hook Farm there with native plants, and they are some of the best native plants around. So if you can get to Hungry Hook or get to one of these events, I would definitely do that. We have been invited back to the Philadelphia Honey Fest to do some education about native plants and native pollinators. It's 3 different evenings, well, actually 1 evening and 2 daytimes in September. I am available all 3 of these dates this year, so that's really exciting. But if anybody wants to join me to talk to people, they get hundreds and hundreds of people who want to learn about honeybees and then fall in love with native plants and native pollinators, mostly because I put that bug in their ear. But they don't even know they want that information until they stop by the table and find out. They, at Bartram's Garden at least, have a native plant sale there, so that's great to stop by. I found some really good things there. I got bladdernut last year, which I was worried the rabbits decimated, but they came back and are looking pretty good. So I was excited about that. And at Bartram's Garden, they have a lot of native plants planted that you can walk around and look and enjoy. I had my first pawpaw from the ground there at Bartram's Garden. Very excited. Speaking of pawpaws, the Pawpaw Festival is coming up in September. I think we should go. I have to see if I work or not, but we've been told that there's a few vendors and a great event for a couple hours. So it's a long drive for that. So we might have to plan some other fun things to do in the area, but they're going to have a lot of vendors and a lot of things to do. So that's exciting. Our upcoming meetings, this is still our schedule. We have Mark in September and November. Very excited about that. We are still buttoning up things for October. We're waiting on confirmation on that speaker. And then in December, we will do a wild seed collection presentation. And then I just wanted to share a couple of fun things that I found in the gardens the last couple days. A tiny little praying mantis baby. A tiny, tiny little swallowtail caterpillar. I meant to take a picture of bird poop that was on a different leaf because they look strikingly similar and I wanted to share that, but then I forgot the poop. So sorry, use your imagination. It looked a lot like that caterpillar. This fun yellow caterpillar that I definitely didn't touch. He looked like he wouldn't be comfortable to touch, but he was very exciting. I don't know what he was. Hummingbird moth on phlox. I've been able to share pictures of the hummingbird moth on phlox to lots of people who are asking about seeing that on butterfly bush, or what can they plant, and that's just my favorite, so it's great to see. Bumblebees on Joe Pye, also monarchs and eastern tiger swallowtails on Joe Pye. Another really interesting caterpillar that was eating bayberry. So I looked in my caterpillar book. I could narrow it down to a couple things, but I didn't have a definitive answer as to what he was. And then another different praying mantis in a different nymph stage on 3-seeded mercury. He was just hunting. He wasn't eating that plant, but that's one of the plants that I let go as a native with wood sorrel and clearweed when it takes kind of they're ground covers and they keep out worse things, so I let them kind of seed around different places. There's our list of nurseries. So that means that's the end. I'm going to check the chat here and see if there's anything I have to address. So Shannon, I agree, but it was a toss-up between a tussock moth and something else that I've surprised. I should have written it down because I will never remember, but tussock moth or something else. And yes, I agree, Anna was amazing. And great, I will send out the things she sends to me so that Susan can get it up on our website and we can share those resources, the plant lists. I was scribbling the whole time, but I didn't get everything. So does anybody have anything they would like to share from their garden, things that are happening that you're excited about?
Well, I had expanded my front garden bed, and part of what I wanted to do was to plant butterfly milkweed in the very front. It's basically a health strip. They just put a new sidewalk, and it's like full sun, clay soil. So I did that, and lo and behold, it was full of caterpillars. At one point, I had counted like 17 caterpillars all at once, and they were all kind of at the same, like either third or fourth instars. And then I found, after some time, I found 10 chrysalis all over the garden, and I'm sure there were more that I couldn't, find. And then now they have been slowly emerging, and it's just been so neat to see. There have been like 4 or 5 monarch butterflies just flying in between the front garden bed and the back garden bed, and just seeing how just this small space has provided for all of them to complete their cycle, and it's been neat to see.
That is awesome. And almost instant gratification. How exciting.
Yes.
I was noticing today, I have volunteer catalpa trees that I let go, and some years I have a lot of catalpa caterpillars, and some years I don't. And this year I was thinking, I haven't seen any at all, but I happened to go by, and this tiny little like 1-foot volunteer seedling had 6 leaves, and 5 of them had these caterpillars on it. But I needed that tree not to be there, so I cut it off, but I took those leaves with the caterpillars and put them on another catalpa somewhere else that it was okay to be at. So I was like, fine with that. You're going to have plenty to eat. That's fine. I went to my more established tree and I didn't see a single caterpillar, but I saw tons and tons of leaves that have been eaten. I also have a ton of birds. So I think that my birds have kept my catalpa caterpillars in check this year. So they've only been able to eat like half of a leaf before the birds come and swoop them. And that's why I'm not seeing them. Because I know my catbirds, I watched 2 catbirds strip an entire arrowwood viburnum bush of all of its berries before even the elderberries. I was surprised. I thought the elderberries would go first, but no, they really liked the viburnum first. All the drama.
Another exciting thing that's been going on. We have a friend who, she gave us Cecropia moth caterpillars and 2 Luna moth caterpillars. And at first I was like, I know for sure we have a black cherry, but I wasn't too sure if we had the maple, not the maple, the I can't think of the name. But anyway, it was just cool to get the leaves and get them to munch on. I had 5 of the Cecropia moths. All but 1 have made their cocoon. One of them, I didn't have a proper enclosure, and one of them escaped the box I had them in and made its cocoon on the frame of the window, which was fun trying to peel off. And then the Luna moths, they should be hatching next week. So it's going to be exciting. I've never seen a Luna moth in person ever. So I'm really excited. And the kids have just loved seeing them.
I think the Luna moth doesn't live too long, so you better keep your eye on it.
It doesn't. Yep. And then I want to release it in my mother-in-law's woods instead of here, just because here I'm not sure if it would survive. There's like one black walnut way back there, and that's it. And yeah, I don't know.
Good luck.
Rita, when?
Thanks. We move September 30th is the last day that we'll be able to be here. So the plan is to have everything moved by September 24th, and then take that last week to clean the apartment and to tidy up the garden beds and anything that I need to take with me.
Everybody's moving.
Right?
I know.
Mm.
It's, you know.
Susan, is the drought being harsh on everything you have there? Are you doing a lot of extra watering?
Where, me?
Susan,
I'm watering my new stuff, but my established stuff is established. So that's the good news, but I still have so much new stuff. So yes, deep watering of the new stuff, gallon jugs being wheelbarrowed or even driven up the driveway. But I want everything to survive. So yeah, lots of watering.
that establishment part is key.
It is, but once you get it done, especially as Marilyn said, if you train them from the start, and last year was great because it was so wet. So everything I planted last year was really happy. And then this year, what?
I feel like I am cheating a little bit in that I don't think that I've had as much drought as I think other areas have. I mean, we went 3 weeks with, I don't think, any rain, but then we got 5.5 inches in a week.
You had how many inches?
5.5 inches.
I had 1.5.
Yeah,
You're talking about like 2 weeks ago. Oh my gosh.
it was a lot of rain. And I was excited because I had never had a rain gauge before, so I didn't know how much rain we were getting, except that my rain barrel would overflow, and I knew that was a significant amount.
Yeah.
I got a rain gauge, and that was the week we got all that rain. So I was like, it's perfect timing.
Are you sure it's accurate? 5.5 inches is a ton of rain.
It was over like, I say week, but it was like 9 days. We had gotten 2 big storms and like half an inch another evening or something. So yeah, it was over a 9-day period. But yeah, we got as accurate as that rain gauge can be. We got.
Yeah, you never know. It's true, but wow, that's amazing.
You mentioned the rain barrel, and that's one of the things I'd forgotten about in the thought of the month, because rain collection also can be very helpful. And that's something that I hadn't mentioned in that article.
That's a whole separate, we could do a whole separate thought of the month on water-wise gardening. My rain barrel fills up with 1/4 inch of rain. It is wonderful.
Wow.
That's all I need to fill 2 40-gallon barrels. And that
You're
means
kidding.
a lot in terms
Yeah.
of, well, it's roof area. It's just
Yeah.
how much roof area do you have running down one downspout?
Yeah, mine just runs into a drain, so that's a waste.
Oh, so a while back, and I'm talking a couple of years, maybe 5 years, a lot of townships and some of these wildlife areas were having rain barrel workshops, and I don't see nearly as many. I wonder
Maybe it
if we
was too
want to
much
do
of a
that.
fad. And
Well, what if we did that? We'd have to find a source, but there's no reason wild ones couldn't do that.
Great idea.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know that Beth at the Conservancy had somebody in to do a rain barrel workshop. That's actually where I made my rain barrel. So she would probably have a good resource to.
yeah, that would be great. We could all ask around and get a source.
Yeah. I know I would like more rain barrels. I only have one for my chicken coop, and that's what I use.
Yeah, I could use 2 more. Anywhere that you have, and that's the other thing that we could go into is where do you place a rain barrel? And just because you have a downspout, how can you, I use my downspouts
Disseminate
as
it.
garden areas. I use them as garden areas. For some of them, I have that flexible downspout extension that you get at Home Depot, and I just run it out into the bed.
That's cool.
And yeah, so that's where I can put a plant that needs a little bit more water than I can normally
What
give
do you
it.
call it? What do you purchase?
I think it's called a flexible downspout extension. It's plastic. It's very heavy duty plastic. I think it extends to about 7 feet.
How wide is it? Is it?
Whatever a gutter is. 3 by 2. Well, 3 by 4. It's the wide. There's
Okay.
one end is 2x3 if you have the small gutters, the other end is 3x4 if you have the large ones. So you can chain them
great.
together, and I've done that. I've got a chain of 3 at one place. So you can extend it out, and because they come in brown and dark green, so you can disguise them in your ground cover layer of plantings, and nobody will really ever see them. And then you're distributing water. You can also, I've done this, poke holes in the bottom along the length. And so
Mhm.
it's kind of like a drip irrigator, except in fast motion.
That's great.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
know
they're
people,
very
that idea.
versatile.
I know
I
people
like-
do that with their rain barrel also, that they will attach either a soaker hose or a piece of hose so that when it overflows, when the rain barrel is full, anything extra is being diverted out into an area or soaking something that would take.
Yeah, for overflow, you have to use a fairly large diameter hose, because if you're overflowing, it's a lot of rain. And so a little garden hose is too small, but you can drill a hole. Usually you have to retrofit the rain barrels. They're never made right. But at the top of right below the lip, no, it's seriously, right below the lip, you can put,
Somebody's
I
phone.
think it's called stormwater drain hose. It's 2-inch, very flexible, very lightweight. So you can sort of move it, and it comes in, you can buy it in 20-foot lengths. So instead of all of the water just flowing over the top of your rain barrel, which it otherwise would do, you try and direct as much of it out as you can. So you drill yourself a hole, you find some sort of little screw-in fitting in the plumbing section of Lowe's or Home Depot, and then you attach this stormwater drainage thing with a what do you call it, Fernco clamps. So it's a waterproof clamp. And
Well,
then you
you'll
just
have
send
to
your
run, you'll
overflow
have
out.
to do a whole thing on it so we can learn how to do this.
I kind of think we should. We should get a
I think
rain
we
barrel
should.
expert. And you met Beth Myers, Jesse? Yeah, let's see if Beth would do that presentation for us, and then we can find a source of rain barrels. And
She got somebody to do the presentation. I don't remember who it was, but she would be the one to ask who.
okay.
Yeah.
Might just be somebody else at her organization.
Right. And if we could either do it as the whole presentation or at least the thought of the month or something like that, because I don't know.
Depending on what we find out.
Yeah.
That could become a whole presentation, because you can go into how to create little miniature garden beds at every downspout. So some of them are rain barrels, and some of them you can use this gutter extender. So downspouts can be transitioned from a waste of water to a new garden bed. Maybe for me, it's the only place in my entire yard where I can have plants that like any moisture at all, because otherwise I have dry.
Wow.
So it can be really useful.
I like
Well,
that. And
Good to think about. I like that.
Shannon, I actually think now that you mentioned it, I think I was telling you about Beth and the rain barrel workshop too. So we might be going just down the same route. So, yep.
That sounds like a great idea. Let's work on it.
All right.
Okay, guys, I've got to pack it in.
Yeah, I've got to go down and watch my bread. Phase 2 of the bread maker. The timer just
Good
went off.
meeting. It was nice to see everybody.
You too, Marilyn. Have fun in Maine.
And all
Enjoy
the
your
people
August
that are
up there.
moving, have a good time moving.
Great.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Wow. I can't
Bye,
believe it.
everybody.
Will we
Bye.
see you again? Rita, will you be back? Will you be with us?
Oh, yes. I'm
Oh,
just
okay.
moving to Gap. So
Oh,
I'll
okay,
be closer to
Okay.
Phoenixville, actually.
Okay. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Okay, good night, guys.